The rhythmic, suffocating beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile, freezing hospital room when my wife of 5 years placed the manila folder on my thin blanket. I was 32 years old, completely bald from aggressive chemotherapy, 80 pounds lighter than my normal weight, and fighting a grueling battle against stage 3 lymphoma. My veins burned with toxic chemicals designed to keep me alive, but at that exact moment, I felt colder than I ever had in my entire life. I looked up at Chloe, the woman I had promised to love in sickness and in health, hoping to see a shred of empathy in her eyes. Instead, she wouldn't even look at me. She was wearing a brand new designer trench coat, her hair perfectly blown out, smelling of expensive perfume. She looked at her luxury watch, sighed impatiently, and tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the folder. Inside were divorce papers. She told me in a voice as casual as if she were ordering a coffee that she couldn't handle the depressing atmosphere anymore. She said she didn't sign up to be a nursemaid, that she was young and needed to live her life, and that my illness was holding her back. As I stared at her in absolute silent shock, unable to even muster the strength to speak, my parents and my younger brother walked into the room. I thought for one desperate fleeting second that my family had come to comfort me, to chase her away, to hold my hand. But they didn't. My father stepped forward, holding a separate stack of legal documents, and looked at my hollow, dying face. With a straight face, he told me that since I wasn't going to survive the year, and since Chloe was leaving me, it was only logical that I sign my house and my life insurance policy over to my perfectly healthy, chronically unemployed brother. They were literally picking my bones clean before my heart even stopped beating, but they made one fatal miscalculation. I didn't die. To understand how a family could stand in a cancer ward and attempt to rob their dying son, you have to understand the absolute nightmare that was my childhood. From the moment I was born, I was an obligation. But from the moment my younger brother Julian was born, he was a miracle. Julian was the golden child, a boy who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of my parents. The dynamic was established early and enforced with brutal consistency. I was the workhorse. Julian was the show pony. If Julian wanted a new video game console, my parents would dip into their savings without a second thought. If I needed new shoes for school, I was told to get a paper route and learn the value of $1. My parents formulated a toxic philosophy to justify their blatant favoritism. They claimed I was resilient and independent, which meant I didn't need their help, while Julian was sensitive and special, which meant he needed to be coddled, protected, and funded. That philosophy dictated every single aspect of my life. When I was 16, I worked grueling weekend shifts at a hardware store to save up for a used, beat-up sedan so I could drive myself to school and extracurriculars. The day I proudly brought it home, my parents forced me to hand the keys over to Julian, who had just gotten his license, arguing that he needed a safe vehicle to get to his social events, while I was used to taking the bus anyway. When I fought back, they called me selfish and grounded me for a month. That was the moment I realized I was entirely on my own. I poured every ounce of my frustration into my academics. I earned a full-ride scholarship to a prestigious university, studied software engineering, and built a lucrative career as an independent data architect, designing complex financial algorithms for massive logistics companies. I moved out the day I turned 18 and built a life of quiet stability. I met Chloe when I was 25. She was a junior associate at a local marketing firm, incredibly ambitious, charming, and seemingly grounded. We bonded over our shared desire for success. For the first few years of our marriage, things were good. We bought a beautiful home in the suburbs, built up our savings, and planned for the future. But as my income grew, so did Chloe's appetite for status. The modest, hardworking woman I married slowly morphed into someone entirely consumed by appearances. She complained that my remote tech job wasn't glamorous enough. She hated that I preferred quiet evenings at home over rubbing elbows at high society galas. She eventually landed a senior role at Vanguard Elite, one of the most prestigious cutthroat marketing and PR firms in the city, run by a charismatic, arrogant CEO named Richard. As she climbed the corporate ladder, she began spending more time at work, attending expensive networking dinners, and completely detaching from our marriage. I tried to communicate, tried to plan vacations, tried to bridge the gap, but she was always too busy. And then the universe pulled the rug out from under me. I started feeling exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. I found a lump under my arm. A week later, I was sitting in a freezing oncologist's office, listening to a doctor gently explain that I had stage 3 lymphoma and that we needed to begin an aggressive, high-dose chemotherapy regimen immediately. I remember the drive home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind spinning with terrifying statistics and the overwhelming fear of my own mortality. When I walked through the front door and told Chloe the news, I expected her to cry. I expected her to hold me. Instead, she stared at me with wide eyes, her face draining of color, and her very first words were, "But what about the company retreat to Aspen next month? I already bought my ski gear." That should have been the moment I walked away, but the fear of dying alone kept me anchored to a woman who was already halfway out the door. The treatment began, and it was a descent into absolute hell. The chemotherapy ravaged my body. My hair fell out in clumps on my pillow. I lost my appetite entirely, vomiting until my ribs bruised. I became too weak to walk up the stairs of my own home, forced to set up a makeshift bed in our downstairs office. I was fighting for my life, drowning in physical agony, and my wife treated me like a repulsive inconvenience. Chloe stopped eating dinner with me. She stopped asking how my appointments went. She would come home from work, wrinkle her nose at the smell of the sterile medical supplies in the house, and immediately go upstairs. She started working late every single night, claiming that Richard, her CEO, needed her for critical strategy sessions. The isolation was suffocating, but the betrayal was just beginning. Word of my diagnosis eventually reached my parents. I hadn't spoken to them in months, preferring to keep my distance from their toxic demands. But one afternoon, while I was hooked up to an IV pole in the outpatient infusion center, feeling like battery acid was being pumped through my veins, my parents and Julian walked in. I felt a brief, desperate surge of hope. Maybe this was the wake-up call they needed. Maybe facing the reality of losing their eldest son would finally break through their delusion. I was wrong. My mother sat in the chair next to my bed, looking around the cancer ward with an expression of profound distaste. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't offer a word of comfort. Instead, she leaned in and said, "Mark, you look terrible. You're putting an awful lot of stress on Chloe, you know. She called us the other night crying. She said your medical bills are eating into her lifestyle, and that living with you is like living in a hospice. It's incredibly selfish of you to drag her down with you." I was too weak to even raise my voice. "I'm fighting cancer, Mom," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I'm fighting for my life." "Well, you need to be realistic," my father chimed in, crossing his arms over his chest. "Julian has had a string of bad luck. His startup failed. He maxed out his credit cards, and he's facing eviction. Since your prognosis isn't great, and you can't even enjoy your money right now, we think it's only fair that you help your brother out. Give him your savings. It's the least you can do." Julian stood there, perfectly healthy, wearing a designer jacket he couldn't afford, smirking at me. "Yeah, man, you don't really need the cash right now. I'll pay you back if you pull through, I swear." The sheer staggering audacity of it broke something inside of me. I looked at the three of them, these emotional vampires who saw my impending death not as a tragedy, but as a financial opportunity. I hit the call button for the nurse and asked them to be removed. My father cursed at me, calling me an ungrateful, spiteful son, before security escorted them out. That night, the darkness in my hospital room felt absolute. I was entirely alone, facing a terminal diagnosis, with a family that wanted me dead and a wife who couldn't stand the sight of me. But the darkest day of my life arrived 2 weeks later during an inpatient stay. My white blood cell count had crashed, and I was isolated in a sterile room, battling a severe infection. I was at the absolute lowest point of my physical existence. The door clicked open, and Chloe walked in. She wasn't wearing the casual, comfortable clothes a spouse wears to a hospital. She was dressed to the nines, a sharp, tailored skirt suit, expensive jewelry, her makeup flawless. She stood at the foot of my bed, maintaining a safe physical distance as if my cancer were contagious. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and dropped it onto my blanket. The sound of the heavy paper hitting my chest echoed in the quiet room. "What is this?" I rasped, my throat raw from coughing. "It's over, Mark," she said. her voice devoid of a single ounce of emotion. "These are divorce papers. I've already signed them. My lawyer drafted them favorably for me, considering the emotional distress you've put me through. You just need to sign them." I stared at the folder, my mind struggling to process her words through the haze of fever and medication. "You're leaving me? Now? While I'm in the hospital?" "I can't do this anymore," she sighed, crossing her arms defensively. "This isn't the life I envisioned for myself. I'm young. I'm successful. I can't spend my best years trapped in a house that smells like sickness, watching you slowly wither away. It's depressing. It's affecting my work performance." Richard noticed I've been distracted, and he offered me a place to stay. The name hit me like a physical blow. "Richard? Your boss? You're leaving me for your boss?" Chloe rolled her eyes, completely devoid of shame. "Richard understands me. He's vibrant. He's healthy. He takes me to galas and important dinners. You can barely walk to the bathroom without gasping for air. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Mark. Just sign the papers. You don't have the energy for a legal battle anyway." Before I could even formulate a response to the absolute monstrosity of her words, the hospital door opened again. My parents and Julian walked in. I realized instantly that they had coordinated this. They had planned a synchronized attack while I was at my most vulnerable. My father didn't even acknowledge Chloe. He walked right up to the side of my bed, holding his own stack of legal documents. "Mark," we spoke to Chloe, "since the marriage is dissolving and your assets are going to be tied up in probate when you pass, we had an estate lawyer draw up these transfer documents." My mother leaned over, pointing a manicured finger at the papers. "This signs the deed of your house over to Julian, and this changes the primary beneficiary of your life insurance policy from Chloe to Julian. It's the right thing to do, Mark. You have no children. Julian has a whole life ahead of him. You don't want your legacy to be one of selfishness, do you?" Julian stood at the back of the room, looking at his phone, completely detached from the fact that his family was currently stripping his dying brother of everything he owned. I looked at my wife, who was waiting for me to sign away our marriage so she could sleep with her boss. I looked at my parents, who were trying to steal my home to fund their golden child's lavish lifestyle. I was weak. I was dying. But in that moment, a profound, blinding rage ignited in my chest. It wasn't a hot, chaotic anger. It was a cold, razor-sharp fury. It cut through the brain fog, the nausea, and the fear. With a trembling hand, I picked up Chloe's divorce papers. I didn't read them. I signed my name at the bottom. I threw the folder back at her. "Take it," I whispered, my voice laced with venom. "Take it and get out. You deserve each other." Chloe snatched the folder, looking slightly offended by my tone, and walked out without a second backward glance. I then turned my attention to my father's documents. I picked up the pen, looked my father directly in the eyes, and slowly, deliberately, ripped the estate transfer papers in half. Then I ripped them in quarters. I let the pieces fall onto the hospital floor like snow. "I'm not dead yet," I said, my voice eerily calm. "And even if I die tomorrow, Julian will not get a single dime of my money. My will stipulates that every asset I own will be liquidated and donated to a cancer research charity. You get nothing. None of you get anything. If any of you ever step foot in my hospital room again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Get out of my sight." My father's face turned purple with rage. He opened his mouth to scream at me, but the sheer intensity in my eyes stopped him. My mother gasped, grabbing Julian's arm, and the three of them backed out of the room, muttering curses and insults as they left. When the door finally clicked shut, leaving me in total silence, I didn't cry. Crying was a waste of energy, and I suddenly needed every ounce of energy I had. My family and my wife thought I was a corpse waiting to happen. They thought I was weak. They thought they had won. And miraculously I won. 10 months after my diagnosis, my oncologist walked into my room with a stunned smile on his face. The scans were completely clear. I was in total remission. The cancer was gone. I walked out of that hospital a completely different man. I was physically scarred, thin, and emotionally hardened, but my mind was sharper than ever. I finalized my divorce, letting Chloe take a modest cash settlement just to get her out of my life quickly, protecting my major assets. I moved into a luxury apartment downtown and focused entirely on my software. 2 months after my remission, I presented my algorithm to a major venture capital firm under a strict non-disclosure agreement. They were blown away. The software had the potential to save global shipping conglomerates billions of dollars in logistics errors. A massive bidding war erupted. Within 6 months of leaving the hospital, I sold the proprietary rights to a major tech conglomerate for an astronomical, life-changing sum. It was a 9-figure payout. I was 33 years old, entirely healthy, and possessed more wealth than my entire family and ex-wife could even conceptualize. But I wasn't done. I had promised myself a reckoning in that hospital room, and I'm a man of my word. I hired a team of private investigators and financial analysts to look into Vanguard Elite, the PR firm where Chloe and her new CEO boyfriend Richard worked. What my team uncovered was a goldmine of corporate incompetence. Richard was a nepo baby who had inherited the firm from his father. He was incredibly arrogant but completely inept at running a business. He had been funneling company funds into disastrous vanity projects and living a lavish lifestyle on the company dime. Chloe, who had been promoted to vice president based purely on her romantic relationship with Richard, was alienating clients left and right with her arrogant attitude. Even worse, my investigators discovered that Richard had recently hired my brother Julian as a creative consultant with a massive salary, entirely as a favor to Chloe to keep her happy. Vanguard Elite was hemorrhaging money. They were on the absolute brink of bankruptcy, desperately seeking a silent investor to buy out their massive debts and save them from total ruin. I smiled. The universe had delivered them right into my hands. Through a network of anonymous shell companies and elite corporate lawyers, I orchestrated a hostile, completely silent takeover. I bought up Vanguard's debt from their terrified creditors for pennies on the dollar. I leveraged that debt to force the remaining board members to sell me their majority shares. Over the course of 3 weeks, without Richard, Chloe, or Julian ever knowing my name, I became the absolute, uncontested majority owner of Vanguard Elite. I made sure I was on the guest list, and as a special touch, I had my legal team send an anonymous, highly official email to my parents, inviting them to the gala under the pretense that Julian was receiving a massive corporate award for his outstanding contributions to the firm. I knew their egos wouldn't allow them to miss a chance to gloat about their golden child. The day of the gala arrived. I spent hours getting ready. I wore a bespoke, midnight black Italian suit tailored perfectly to my now healthy, muscular frame. My hair had grown back, thick and dark. I looked into the mirror and saw a powerful, wealthy, unbreakable man staring back. The dying ghost in the hospital bed was gone forever. I arrived at the grand ballroom 30 minutes into the event. The room was packed with hundreds of employees, industry elites, and open bars. I stood near the back, hiding in the shadows of the massive floral arrangements. I saw my parents standing near the front stage, sipping champagne, looking incredibly smug. I saw Julian standing with them, wearing a ridiculous velvet blazer, boasting loudly to anyone who would listen. And then I saw Chloe. She was hanging onto Richard's arm, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, looking at the crowd with an expression of absolute superiority. Richard stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "Welcome! As you all know, Vanguard Elite has recently undergone a major financial restructuring. We have secured a massive influx of capital from a private investor who believes in our vision, our leadership, and our incredible team." He smiled down at Chloe, who beamed back at him. "Tonight, the primary shareholder of our new parent company is here to address the firm. Please join me in giving a warm Vanguard welcome to our new owner." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Richard looked around the room, expecting some old, stuffy billionaire to walk down the center aisle. I stepped out from the shadows. I didn't rush. I walked down the center aisle with slow, deliberate, heavy steps. The rhythmic clicking of my leather shoes on the marble floor echoed through the silent ballroom. As I moved closer to the stage, the confused whispers began to ripple through the crowd. My parents saw me first. My mother's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering violently against the floor. My father's jaw unhinged, his eyes bulging out of his head as if he were looking at a ghost. Julian literally stumbled backward, knocking into a cocktail table. I kept walking until I reached the steps of the stage. I walked up, stood right next to Richard, and calmly adjusted my cuffs. Chloe was staring at me, her face completely drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound came out. She recognized my face, but she couldn't comprehend the reality of the healthy, dominating presence standing in front of her. Richard frowned, looking at me with severe annoyance. "Excuse me, pal. I don't know who you are, but this stage is reserved for the new owner. Security." I didn't look at Richard. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the thick, legally binding dossier of the corporate buyout, and slammed it down onto the podium right in front of him. "I suggest you read the signature on the majority shareholder agreement, Richard," I said, my voice deep, calm, and carrying through the microphone for the entire room to hear. Richard angrily flipped open the folder. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, dropping down to the signature line. He read the name. He looked up at me, the arrogance instantly evaporating from his face, replaced by absolute, unadulterated terror. You're Mark Evans?" Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "The tech billionaire? The one who bought the debt?" "I am," I replied smoothly. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with my ex-wife. "Hello, Chloe. It's been a while. You're looking well. A lot better than the last time you saw me anyway." Chloe's legs literally gave out. She collapsed into a chair behind Richard, hyperventilating, her hands shaking violently. The entire ball. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, crushing reality of his situation silenced him. He looked like a deflated balloon. Two burly security guards stepped onto the stage and grabbed him by the arms, hauling the former CEO away as the crowd watched in stunned silence. I turned my attention to the chair where my ex-wife was trembling. I walked over and stood over her. "Chloe," I said softly, but the microphone picked up every word. "You left your husband to die alone in a hospital room because his cancer was depressing and inconvenient to your lifestyle. You climbed the corporate ladder by sleeping with the man who was running this company into the ground. You have zero marketing skills, terrible client retention, and an attitude problem that has cost this firm millions." "Mark, please," Chloe whispered, actual tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. "I'm sorry. I was scared. I made a mistake. Please, I have nothing without this job. We were married. You loved me once." "I loved an illusion," I corrected her coldly. "You are terminated, Chloe. Clean out your desk by morning. You're banned from the building." Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably in front of her peers, colleagues, and industry rivals. Her humiliation was absolute, public, and permanent. Finally, I turned my gaze out to the crowd, locking onto the three people standing near the front row, looking like they were about to face a firing squad. "Julian," I called out. My brother flinched as if he had been struck. "I reviewed your employment contract this morning," I continued, pacing the edge of the stage. "You were hired as a creative consultant with a base salary of $150,000 a year, yet there is no record of you producing a single piece of creative material, attending a single client meeting, or logging a single hour of actual work. You are a parasite hired through nepotism. You are terminated, and I will be legally pursuing the return of every stolen dollar this firm paid you." Julian panicked. He looked at our parents, desperate for them to fix his mess like they always did. My father stepped forward, his face pale, his hands shaking. He tried to force a sickeningly sweet smile. "Mark, son, this is incredible. We thought you were gone. We prayed for you. This is a miracle. Look at you. You're a powerhouse. Please, son, let's go somewhere private and talk. We're family. Julian is your brother. He needs this job. We can work this out." I stared at the man who had stood over my deathbed and tried to steal my house. "You are not my family," I said, my voice echoing like thunder through the silent room. My family died the day they walked into a cancer ward, handed a dying man transfer papers, and tried to strip him of his life savings to fund a spoiled brat. You told me my legacy. The guards didn't hesitate. They moved in, grabbing Julian and my father. My parents screamed, cried, and begged as they were physically dragged through the crowd of hundreds of gaping onlookers. They were hauled out of the grand ballroom, their pathetic cries fading into the hallway until the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. I stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of terrified employees. I took a deep, grounding breath. The anger that had kept me alive, the fury that had fueled my recovery, slowly dissolved, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. I had exorcised the demons of my past. I had severed the dead weight. To the remaining staff of Vanguard Elite, I said calmly, tomorrow at 8 a.m. we start rebuilding. Have a good evening. I dropped the microphone. It hit the podium with a dull